Hi there, welcome back to Bio with Harb. In this video, we'll be talking about the biochemistry of lipids. Lipids are nonpolar molecules in nature, meaning they're hydrophobic, they don't mix well with water, so we'll discuss that. And we'll also discuss the four main classes of lipids that you should be familiar with. That's going to be triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and then waxes. So our first group of lipids that we look at are triglycerides. And so triglycerides are going to be the dietary fats. When we talk about fat in terms of diet, your saturated, unsaturated, and trans fats, that's going to be your triglycerides. Coming from the fact that you have 1, 2, and 3 fatty acids. Glyceride is going to be from the fact for this glycerol, glyceride, okay? And what we're going to do is we're just going to combine these molecules through a reaction. And so that reaction is going to be a dehydration synthesis reaction. So if you're taking a biology class now, or if you've taken one in the past, you've probably been familiar or heard of a dehydration synthesis reaction, or also known as a condensation reaction. This is an anabolic reaction, so it's a building reaction or a synthesis, and it's used to combine molecules. And so in this case, and it does so through the loss of a water. And how that works is we will remove, through the reaction, an enzyme will help this occur. We will remove the hydrogen from one side, the hydroxyl group from the other side. And when those combine, you form a water. And so that'll happen 3 times. So at the end, you'll form 3 waters. And in doing so, we can actually link these molecules together and form our triglycerides. And so this shows you what it looks like when it's done. This is the area here where we lost the water, that hydrogen and that hydroxyl group, and we've formed what is called an ester linkage or an ester bond in that vicinity, and that's what's holding the glycerol and the fatty acid chain together, okay? Now, when we look at these fatty acid chains, and we'll discuss some differences in a moment, but when you look at these fatty acid chains, okay, they are long chains of all hydrogen and carbon. And so what we call that is a hydrocarbon chain, okay, hydrogen-carbon. Hydrocarbon chain. Now, what's unique about this, or what is special in the sense of the lipids, is that because they have these long hydrocarbon chains and their fatty acid tails, these sections are very nonpolar, okay? So when talking about polarity and why molecules are polar, it's all due to an electronegativity difference. And so electronegativity is the difference in pulling of electrons. So for an example, water is a polar molecule, which is why polar, nonpolar don't mix well. Water and oil don't mix, water and lipids. But water is polar because it has oxygen attached to hydrogen. Oxygen is very strong, very electronegative. And so there's a difference in sharing, which causes opposite charges. It has an unequal sharing of electrons. Carbon and hydrogen not only are not very electronegative in the regard of themselves, but they also, in hydrocarbon chains of the fatty acids, are very symmetrical. You notice that this chain looks very symmetrical, kind of nice and organized. And so there's not going to be a lot of polarity there. There's not going to be unequal sharing. So therefore, there's no charges, which makes this a very nonpolar section, nonpolar molecule, okay? So there's no charge, there's no difference in the sharing of electrons. And this is why, at least with the triglycerides, but again, all lipids are in a sense nonpolar, but triglycerides themselves, this is why they're going to be considered nonpolar. The main part of the molecule, the hydrocarbon chain, is very, very nonpolar, okay? And again, like I stated, we form 3 waters, we form 3 ester bonds, and now we're looking at our nonpolar fatty acid chain. So this would be a triglyceride, okay? Now, discussing the different types of triglycerides, and again, these would make up the 3 tails of your fatty acid chains of your triglyceride. You can have either a saturated fatty acid, you can have unsaturated, or you can have trans fatty acids. Now, the saturated and unsaturated are going to be the ones that your body most readily uses and will like to have available. Now, you can obviously, by looking at these pictures, hopefully see the difference in a saturated and unsaturated fatty acid. Saturated is a nice, even, straight chain, okay? And if you look at the unsaturated fatty acids, they actually have a bend in the chain. And that can actually keep going on, and you can have bends throughout the chain as you go. But the saturated will always stay straight, if I draw as straight as I can here. Okay? Now, what you should notice is this area right here in the unsaturated fatty acid and how that's different from the saturated fatty acid structure. Saturated fatty acids are, we say, saturated with hydrogen. And what that means is, if you look at the nonpolar hydrocarbon chain, all of the possible bonds around carbon are fully filled or saturated with hydrogen. And we see that. If you look at the unsaturated fatty acids, they are not all filled with hydrogen. We have a double bond here, which takes away one of the possible bonds on each of these carbons to be filled with hydrogen. Okay? Instead of having 1, 2, 3, and 4 hydrogens here in this vicinity, we only have 2. And that's because of this double bond right here. Okay? So the main difference between saturated and unsaturated fatty acids is the presence of at least one double bond. Okay? And that double bond causes the bend in the chain of the unsaturated fatty acids. Now, in terms of diet, or how this would be seen in real life terms here, when you look at food and the diet you eat, saturated fats are going to be solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are going to be liquid. So these are going to be things like butter or animal fat, the white part of like a steak or chicken. And these are going to be your oils. So plant oils, canola oil, avocado oil, peanut oil, olive oil, all that stuff. So saturated fat gets a bad rep. You need saturated fats. You need saturated fatty acids in your body as you need unsaturated fatty acids in your body. Okay, they're both very important. Your body uses both of them readily, not only for energy, because energy is one of the main functions of lipids, long-term energy. Carbohydrates are going to provide your quicker energy, but they provide a ton of energy, but you need fatty acids to make up your phospholipids, which make up the cell membrane, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they also do other things as well. I mean, lipids play a wide number of roles. There's energy, insulation, protection. Like we've said, they're hormones. So we'll talk about chemical messengers, the steroids, and they make up your cell membranes, the phospholipids. So you need both types of these triglycerides. The reason why saturated fatty acids get the bad rep is because of their structure. So, in bio, you keep saying structure determines function. The straight nature of a saturated fatty acid, and because they're solid at room temperature, they will tend to settle out of the bloodstream more if you have an excess of them in your body. And so these are the ones that if you have excess and you eat a lot of excess calories and a lot of excess fat, including saturated fat, they can start to help to block your capillaries, your arteries, and that's where you can have atherosclerosis happening, which is hardening of those arteries with plaque and buildup, and that's what leads to heart disease and other issues. That is why they get the bad rep. Now, obviously, if you have too many unsaturated fatty acids, that can also happen, but because they're liquid and they are oily, they flow better, and that's due to their structure as well. They're not going to stack as easily as these straight chain saturated ones. These will tend to flow past one another. And so they are liquid already, and so they will flow better in the blood and not settle out as easily. Okay. But again, you need both. They are both very helpful. They're part of a healthy diet, but again, too much, not a good thing. Trans fats. So if you notice, let me erase this here. If you notice, what we have and this is more of like getting into chemistry and organic chemistry terms, but a cis action around a double bond is where the molecules on those are around the same side. Cis means same. Okay, a trans fat is built by actually bubbling hydrogen into the molecule, and what happens is they actually line up trans or opposite of one another. Now, it doesn't seem like too much of an issue, but now you notice that because it's in the trans orientation, it's still a straight chain. It does not bend like this one does up here. And what happens is our body does not recognize the trans fats as well as the unsaturated and saturated, so it does not break down as easily. And then that can cause issues when things are hanging around the body more and more, not being broken down readily. That's where we can have some issues in terms of complications. An example of this was back in the 90s, and I think they still use it in some, very, very limited, but some food items. It's called olestra. It's an artificial fat. Essentially, they took a bunch of fatty acid chains and put them around a sugar. But again, your body doesn't recognize it very well at all. There's no enzyme to break cholesterol down. And so it would basically pass through the system and cause issues, cramping, diarrhea, basically stomach discomfort. But it was basically an artificial fat that gave the feeling and the taste of fat, but not all the calories. So it was used in like, diet foods or fat-free foods. Our next class is phospholipids, and these are going to be the makers of the cell membrane. And so I'll do a video just on the cell membrane itself, talking about these more in depth. But again, we know that these are nonpolar in nature. Now, the interesting and really unique thing about phospholipids is they are what we call amphipathic molecules, meaning they have a polar region, which is going to be the head, and they have a nonpolar region, which is going to be the tails, okay? So the tails are just fatty acids, either unsaturated or saturated. They are hydrocarbon chains, and just like we talked about with triglycerides, they're going to be nonpolar for that reason. But the head, if you take a look at the phosphate glycerol head, you notice that with this phosphate group, there is a charge, there's a negative. When there's charge, we can have polar interactions, which is why this is a polar region, okay? So the polar head is going to be hydrophilic. It likes water. The tail is nonpolar, hydrophobic. They hate water. This becomes important, why it's so unique making up the cell membrane, which is the protector of the inside of the cell, is because these nonpolar tails can hang out in the inside shielded from the water, and the heads can be around the water, which if you think about what cells are, on the inside of a cell, you're going to have water, and on the outside, you'll have water. And so these phospholipids allow this membrane to protect the cell and only let certain things in and out, but it also orients themselves in a way where they can interact with water on the side that they can and want to, but keep the tails that are nonpolar hidden from the water. And so that's what's really unique about these phospholipids. But again, makes up the cell membrane. It's amphipathic. It has a polar and nonpolar side. And that's why it associates itself the way it does with this phospholipid bilayer. Steroids are going to be your chemical messengers. Now, so they're known as hormones. There are also protein or amino acid hormones, which we can talk about with proteins, but your lipids are also part of your hormone structure. And that's why it's super important, again, to have fat in your diet, because, many people go on this, well, I hate, fat has this bad rep, I'm not going to go on a low-fat diet. And one of the problems that you see with low-fat diets is moodiness and other changes that are basically regulated by hormones. And that's because your fats, if you don't have enough, you're not making enough hormones to help your body do the functions that it needs to do. Probably one of the most popular ones, or ones we worry about the most, is cholesterol. And cholesterol is super important. As you can see, it's these little yellow pieces in the cell membrane. It helps maintain membrane fluidity. So along with the phospholipids, it helps keep the membrane fluid. And so, for example, when it's like cold out and the membrane or the cells are exposed to cold temperatures, cholesterol keeps the membrane from freezing. It keeps them spaced apart. When temperatures rise and the membrane gets really fluid and starts flowing really fast, it also makes sure that the phospholipids will not move so fast that they rip apart from one another. And so it's super important in membrane fluidity. But other hormones, cortisol is the stress hormone. We have testosterone, estrogen, which those are sex hormones. So again, steroids and the lipids that associate with steroids, super important in terms of body function. The last class we talk about, and we don't have structure here, we don't really spend too much time on them, at least in my course with bio, is waxes. But again, super important in terms of biological function. So we have a nice picture of a little otter here. Waterfowl, so ducks and other birds that associate themselves with water will have these. Plants have waxes. And essentially what waxes are, just how you might think of a wax like from a candle or something. Again, nonpolar, but waxes help prevent water loss. And so, so in plants it helps prevent water loss. In animals like the otter or birds, for example, it helps keep water out, okay? You can imagine birds, if their feathers got really wet when they were in the water, they would not be able to fly very well. And so the waxes on their feathers, the coating they have, helps keep that water out and allows them to fly when they need to. And that is lipids. So nonpolar molecules, lots of functions, lots of important things for the body. And I hope that was super helpful, you guys. I will see you in the next one.